Welcome to Conversations, a podcast provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders and sponsored by Grace Theological Seminary. I'm Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. Let's jump into the conversation for today. I want to welcome everybody to the Conversations broadcast and podcast today, provided by the Center for Thriving Leaders, sponsored by Grace College and Seminary. I'm Dr. Trent Lambert, and we are here to help leaders thrive in ministry. So let's jump right into our conversation for today. And today we have the great honor and privilege to have Dr. Jeff Myers in the house. We're so happy about that. And so, Dr. Myers, thanks for being here today.
Dr. Trent, well, great to be with you. You know, I love this place. I love the seminary here and the college. I've spoken here on a number of occasions over the years and have really enjoyed the students. And I'm so glad for what you're doing and helping prepare pastors and leaders for these times.
Thank you. I appreciate that. God is doing some incredible things here in Grace College and Seminary. We're writing some new things, some new offerings, some hybrids, some online pieces. And what a great spiritual legacy we have in this area with, of course, Billy Sunday being here years ago. And also over in Westy Hall, the room that Billy Graham prayed in all night, and then he began to launch his crusade starting in Los Angeles. So the seminary has a lot of heritage, and we know God is doing some exciting things now. So right to the task, Dr. Jeff Myers is president of Summit Ministries, a Colorado-based non-for-profit organization that equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. Summit reaches hundreds of thousands of Christians each year through worldview training, events, books and curriculum, and other online resources. One of America's most respected authorities on Christian worldview, apologetics, and youth leadership development, Myers lives in Colorado Springs with his family, and as mentioned earlier, we have the pleasure of having him with us today. And Dr. Myers, I am so excited today to begin to talk about your book. The other night, I was winding down the day and got into bed, and my wife said, "You have to read this book." And it was a long day, and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm done. I'm done.
Yeah.
And she pulled out this book called Truth Changes Everything. And I began to flip through the pages and read a little bit. And Dr. Myers, thanks for keeping me up all night.
You're welcome.
Great read.
I'll buy the next round of coffee. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that so much, because the whole point of writing the book was, we know there's a battle over truth. We know that today, more people than not believe that truth is up to the individual. In fact, 75% of millennials say they believe that what works for them and what they feel is best for their own lives is the only truth you can know. So we've tipped, and that is not a good thing for our culture. But how do you process it? If we used to say, seek the truth, and now we say, speak your truth, I mean, why does it really matter, and who cares? If you're at a seminary and you've got a philosophy class, you can go into great detail about defending objective truth and refuting the arguments against it. But what most people want is to know, does it really make a difference? Who's living life differently because they know the truth? And that the whole point of the book was just story after story after story from times of great crisis in history, when people knew the truth in Jesus and they stood for it, and the whole world changed.
I cannot wait to dive into some things today. Dr. Myers, I get the privilege of speaking with pastors all across this country. I get the privilege of working with students here on campus. And churches are not the same they used to be. When I talk to pastors and they're trying to get back to pre-COVID, there's no such thing.
Right.
We are at a different time, a different age. Pastors are dealing with different scenarios. As I travel, I get to hear them, and they're dealing with worldview issues. They're dealing with the changes in culture, and they need some help and support. So glad you're here today. Let's dive right in, and let's just start with talking about this book briefly. Please share how this book came about.
Well, I had the opportunity to write this book. It's published by Baker in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I got the contract to write the book. I really knew that I wanted to speak about truth. I really knew that I wanted to tell stories, not just give philosophical arguments, but I wanted it to really come to life. And then I was diagnosed with cancer. And I thought, wow, this might be the last book I ever get to write. And authors think the same thing you would think if you thought, oh, I think my life is coming to an end. Well, then every phone call is different because it might be the last time you get to talk to that person. Every letter you write is different. Every conversation is different. As an author, I had to ask the question, if I only get to write one more book, is this the one I really want to write? And I had been thinking about this idea of truth changes everything for some time, and I realized I think this is the most important message that I've ever had the opportunity to communicate in my life, because it was based on truth, and not just objective truth as in the way the Greek philosophers thought of it as sort of idealistic, but that it's actually personal. The truth exists, and it isn't just a set of mathematical formulas or a set of logical propositions. It's a person. It's Jesus. It was that realization that animated the gospel writers and then started us all the way through church history, and not just church history, but in the history of economics, medical care, politics, justice, art. So I have chapters on all these different things where I'd love for people to come away and think, I can make a difference as an artist or as a scientist. I work in science, I work in art, I work in education, all of those things, that I'm worshiping God in my work, and it is making a difference for generations to come.
I teach in a seminary. We train pastors. We train ministry leaders. But I think our pastors that are listening today need to hear that, years ago when someone said, I'm called to ministry, the immediate response was, well, you must be a pastor, you must be a missionary. Instead of, maybe they're called, as you just said, to be a Christian and make a difference in the work field and business as a teacher. There's so many areas of ministry available for people to tell the truth. It's just not isolated. If you feel called, you have to be that pastor or missionary. And I really believe some people tried to do that and they just weren't called to do it and got frustrated. So I really hope pastors and leaders you're listening today that the call can expand to a lot of areas, just not pastoral ministry, but a lot of different areas in the rhythms of life.
It's wonderful when we work with young adults who are called to pastoral ministry.
It is.
It is equally wonderful when we're working with young adults who are called to biochemistry or astrophysics or car mechanics or building or supply chain management, any of those other things. Nicholas Copernicus, very famous astronomer, started to learn about his theory, develop his theory about the sun being at the center of the solar system, because he was looking to find an accurate date of Easter. And in all of his mathematical calculations, he said this, that when you do this kind of scientific work, it is an act of worship toward God. Very few people have thought about science in that way. But throughout Christian history, scientists did think that way. They thought about what they were doing as an act of worship to God. It's only in our time that we've lost that sense that everything we do is worshiping something, somehow, somewhere, and we want to use it to actually worship God. So I hope it's encouraging to people who are involved in pastoral ministry to think, you now have a whole new way to reach out to the people who are doing all different kinds of jobs, who are part of your congregation, to encourage them that their work is full-time ministry of a different sort.
Well said. Thank you. I believe your book has two main goals. Could you explain what those are and why they're so important?
Well, the first goal was to explain what truth actually is. So truth means reality. When Jesus said, if you follow my teachings, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. The word for truth there is the Greek word aletheia. It means reality. So I wanted people to understand this current way of thinking, I speak my truth, you speak your truth, is essentially making the argument there's no way for us to know reality. It's not knowable by us. It might exist, might not, but we have no way of knowing it. So we just have our own perspectives, and that's all we have. Words bear no necessary relationship to anything that actually exists. Concepts are not meaningful, except that we personally think they might be meaningful for us. So justice, liberty, they're whatever I want them to be. That's not a sustainable kind of world. It's not sustainable personally, Trent. You know, you have a counseling program, and in counseling, people will talk about, you know what, if you want to get better, you've got to grapple with reality as it actually is. The same thing is true in relationships, what psychologists call attunement. You cannot have a relationship with another person unless you have a shared understanding of reality. But I think the same thing is true, Trent, for civilizations. So I really wanted to get that point across. But second, I wanted to give people stories of actual individuals who did make a difference in these areas. Because I could write that book with all the philosophical arguments, and my mother would read it. And you might read it just to be friendly. But that's only two people. What we relate to is not the abstract concepts, but the people. How did actual real people like me live this out?
Well said. Well said. There's something that's on this list here that I'm really kind of curious about. And could you explain the difference between truth and truths?
Yeah. So truth, capital T, is objectively knowable truth. So something that exists independent of us that is knowable. Could be a thing that exists independent of us. More often in philosophy, people think about categories of meaning. So justice would be an example. Justice doesn't stop existing when we go to sleep at night and start existing again when we wake up. Just because we're not paying attention doesn't mean justice doesn't exist. In fact, confusingly but very important, justice doesn't stop existing when we deny that it exists. If we're living in denial or we're deceiving ourselves, it still exists. That's the idea of truth, capital T. What's more popular today is truths, small t, that you don't seek the truth, you just speak your truth, that nothing objectively is knowable by us. That's the dominant view now. And it's wrong.
It is wrong. It is wrong.
Yeah.
In your book, why did you start with the plague to explain truth?
Yeah. Well, I've had a lot of people tell me, Trent, we must live in the worst times. The Lord is going to be coming back soon because no worse times have ever existed in human history. And well, I'm a student of history. I'm a student of philosophy. That was all of my training growing up. And I realized I just don't think people understand what actually took place through the course of time. We do not live in the worst times that have ever existed. In fact, we probably live in some of the best times that have ever existed. As far as our material conditions, access to medical care, economic development, all of those kinds of things. But I decided to go back to the plague, go all the way back to the mid-1300s, where a third to half the people in Europe died in the most gruesome, painful way imaginable from a disease that no one could understand given the current level of medical knowledge. We don't even know how many people died in other places around the world. We only know the figures from Europe because people had written records at that time. But that seemed to me to be the worst imaginable thing that could happen. I just try to think of today, if a third to half of the people of the world died in a horrifying, painful way over the course of just a couple of months, we would think that's probably the end of the world. And furthermore, we would probably think, well, let's abandon God because clearly he has abandoned us. What I found in my research, Trent, is that it's not what happened, that the people actually drew closer to God. Well, how's that possible? Because they developed the theology of Christ's incarnation and suffering. They were thinking to themselves, not, well, God has abandoned us, but God is here with us, suffering alongside of us through Jesus. So I wrote about this. I wanted to test it out. So I was actually in Florence, Italy, and I hired an art tour guide and said, take me through the museums, take me through the academia, take me through the Uffizi Gallery. I want to see, is this really true? And I said, is there any difference that's knowable between pre-plague and post-plague works of art? Without hesitating, this man, who's not a believer, said, absolutely no question, there's a difference. And he said, here's the difference. And he showed me, and you can actually see the difference in the whole style of art, that people began to focus on the reality of Christ. The paintings became more realistic. They focused on Jesus' death and his resurrection, but even his death, showing pictures of his body that were like a realistic, this is what a body actually looks like. This is the suffering that Christ actually went through. And by realizing Jesus is not out there someplace far from us, he's right here with us, suffering with us, actually not only changed art, but it began to change medicine. It began to change all these different areas. And so in the book, I look at the nature of the soul, human value, medicine, art, science, politics, justice, even the nature of our work that we do started to undergo a transformation at that time.
Interesting that you say that, and I'm going to kind of go off our script per se for a moment, but analyzing our current culture post-COVID, do you see any similarities of that aligning with suffering and going through hard times with what we just went through as a country, as a world with COVID? Where do you see people out today post-COVID in light of that?
For at least the last 100 or 150 years, we live in a culture that is superficially religious, but at its core, the way people answer life's most important questions, it's very secular. So I find a lot of people who think, when they think of their COVID experience, that was entirely pointless. There's no point to suffering. And with the rising generation, we see a lot of consequences from that. I mean, you got to keep in mind, Gen Z, when they're asked about their greatest fears, when people my age are asked about their greatest fears, they always start with things like government corruption. But young adults, if you ask them what's your greatest fear, being alone. So COVID played into perhaps the worst fear of their generation, and they were well and truly alone. So what do you do if you're truly alone? You actually become more dependent on things that you think can connect you to the real world that is outside of you. That would have been done through social media. And now we see people at extraordinarily high levels of anxiety, depression, social media addiction, and then all kinds of social contagion that come out of that, where people believe they are one way because they can imagine in their minds that they might be that way, even if it's not actually true in reality. So that part of it has been very destructive because people haven't seen that there was any point to the suffering. Now, having said all of that, I'm watching revivals start to break out among young people who are saying, I've had enough. I know that my response to COVID, I'm not proud of the way I lived during that time, not proud of my choices. I need something. I need Jesus. And on campuses all across the United States and even around the world, we're seeing a fresh move of the Spirit develop, which I think is incredibly exciting. And that would be consistent with history, that people tend to turn to the Lord when all of their other options are exhausted, right? It's like, well, should we pray? Well, has it come to that? Is that, is that really our last possible option? That's when people out of desperation really turn to God, and I'm starting to see it happen in this generation.
Totally agree with you. Of some visiting that I've done with churches and leaders across the country, there's a hunger for the Lord. We're beginning to see, as what you just said, these pockets of revival of God's Spirit is moving and people are listening. I think that's the big thing. People are listening.
Yeah, that's great. Great point.
Help some pastors and leaders right now. And what would you say to Christians who believe truth, capital T, is lost?
I would encourage people to look back to history. And you know what? I think I'd actually put it this way. I would reject the question. I think if somebody says, is truth completely lost? I would say, you know what? I want to pause for a second and ask you why that's even important. How would my answer affect the way you live your life? Because if you say, well, truth is really lost, so there's no point in me doing anything, then you've arrived at a bad conclusion. When I looked at history, and I looked all the way back to the 1300s, there are some sections of the book I look back a little bit farther, but just trying to gain some perspective. I don't think any of the people who really made a difference believed that their lives had mattered. They went to their graves with some of their most pressing questions unanswered. They went to their graves not really knowing that their lives had made a difference, but they acted faithfully anyway. And that faithfulness, I think, is what God's looking for.
Totally agree. Some of our leaders and pastors today, they are struggling dealing with, a lot of current worldview issues. In your book, you write that Christians today can breathe life into others through conversations.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot said through, whether it's small groups or whatever, that relationships, community, conversations are vital. Can you explain what happens in that context of Christians can breathe life into others through conversation?
Love to. Let me give just a few seconds of a background. I'm the president of Summit Ministries. We're a Colorado-based nonprofit organization, as you mentioned earlier, that focuses on training a rising generation of leaders. So students will come and study with us. Churches will send them for 2 weeks. Maybe when they're just graduating high school, they know they're going off to college. It's going to be really tough on their faith. Send them for 2 weeks. Get some time to ask all of their tough questions. Spend time with amazing Christian thought leaders who are directing the conversation, who are in the arena, helping these young adults bridge between high school and college. Well, we realized you can't just teach them facts. You've got to give them a vision for their lives where the facts would actually make a difference. And then you've got to give them the ability to communicate about it. So why is it so important? We do a lot of polling at Summit Ministries, not because we want to be a polling company. We just want to understand the times. And we have found that of all of the people who know the truth about a given issue, half of them never say anything. We've got polling evidence for this. They never say anything. So we asked them, why don't you ever say anything? There were 3 answers. Number 1, I'm afraid I'll be canceled. Number 2, I'm afraid I will give offense. And number 3, I'm afraid that I won't know what to say. So it's super important that we learn how to talk about the truth, not just what it is that we talk about. And so I teach my students just a basic set of questions. I start with helping them develop a curious attitude. So if you're in a conversation, somebody says something you think, man, I think that's pretty far off. Don't just immediately say, I think that's pretty far off. Just ask, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. What do you mean by those terms? How did you arrive at that conclusion? How do you know that's true? The way you framed it made it seem like anybody who would disagree with you would have to be stupid to disagree with you, which puts me in an awkward position because I'm not sure I agree. But, do you think that's the whole story? Those sorts of questions, which are so simple, work just as well when you're dealing with a theological difference as when you're on a college campus and you're dealing with a professor who's coming way in from left field and you aren't sure how to handle it. Questions then become the basis of conversation. And I think I had a friend sit down at breakfast once and he said, did you know that Jesus asked 288 questions in the Gospels? I said, wait a second, you counted them? He said, yes, I counted them. 288 questions. How many sermons have we heard about the teachings of Jesus? And then how many sermons have we heard about the questions of Jesus? So, but it's in that dialogue. It is in the conversation. It is in the walking with. That's where Jesus really trained his disciples. 3 years of earthly ministry, For them to get every place the Gospels say they went, it would have taken 13 months. That's a lot of walking. That's a lot of talking.
Mm-hmm. Right along with that, you share 14 ways to practice speaking up. So let's stay in this context of speaking and talking.
Yeah.
That builds trust. Can you share some of those with us?
Well, let me share one that I think is the one I struggled with the most. I like to get along with people. I want to feel that I'm aligned with them. I don't like to be disagreeable. A lot of people find that surprising because I came up in the world of debate, high school debate, college debate, being a debate coach. I don't like to be disagreeable. I like to find areas of agreement. Well, I found that a lot of things about my Christian faith are rejected by people before they even consider it because they think that by taking a viewpoint, I am being intolerant, and being intolerant is evil. So I'm not just wrong, I'm actually bad. Well, how do you handle a conversation like that? How do you handle when you're in the position of, there are really dramatic differences here? So I thought, if people could know how to do that and not go crazy, they probably could apply that skill to every other area. So the first step is you just acknowledge the differences. I see that we have real differences here. And I want you to know that regardless of what you think about me, I think it's okay to have differences. At the same time, I'd love to find a couple of areas that we agree on, so as we talk about our differences, it doesn't drive us further apart. Can we agree that we really think freedom of speech is a good idea? Can we agree that we all think injustice is bad and we want it to stop? Can we, in other words, you just find those areas where the person's going to agree with you on some things. And then for the rest of the conversation, as you're talking about the issues, you also talk about the talk. So people who are listening right now in pastoral ministry, you do a lot of counseling. Some of that counseling is marital counseling. One of the main rules you learn about marital counseling is when people come in with their disagreement, what it's about is never what it's about.
It's about. So well said.
Yeah. You've got to dig in to find out what's at the core of it. Maybe it's disrespect, a perception of disrespect, or a loss of agreement, or all kinds of things. But what it's about is never what it's about. So the same thing is true in a difficult conversation. When I'm on a university campus, I have a professor, we totally disagree on every single issue. How do we carry on the conversation? I'm always talking about the talk. So, hey, as we're talking along here, I know we're going to find some areas of real disagreement. And to be honest with you, I'm a little nervous because I like to get along with people. I don't like to think that we're in disagreement. But I think we need to press forward. And I just want to say thank you that I value the fact that you're willing to have a conversation with me, even though I might be the kind of person you would ordinarily dismiss. Thank you. You see what I'm doing? I'm actually talking about the talk as much as I'm talking about the subject that
You're diffusing it right away. Yeah.
I mean, my professors used to say all the time, I may disagree with you, but I'll defend to the death your right to say what you say. That you can't assume that people think that way anymore. Because in a world where there's no truth, why would you even bother to listen? You would certainly never give a platform to somebody you disagree with. You wouldn't have a debate with them, because by debating them, you're actually legitimizing their existence, which you would never want to do because it diminishes your power. So you've got to be able to wade into the conversations and say, just, acknowledge this is what's going on. I think this might be very difficult because I'm sure that you think that, from some of the things that you've said, that people who say the things I say and believe the things I believe are ignorant. And I just want you to know, I recognize that a lot of people think that way. And I hope that we can continue having the conversation anyhow.
Great tactic. Yeah, you're diffusing some of that argument right up front. Hey, can we just begin to continue to talk and relay ideas?
Yeah. And Trent, here's, I guess, the final point about this. I don't want to belabor it too much. You can't do this on social media. You just can't. This has to be personal, person to person, but at least some kind of a one-to-one contact. Social media makes things worse because the social media platforms are set up to monetize conflict. Like those algorithms are written to intentionally amplify a conflict because then people will see more advertisements.
Correct. Dr. Myers, in your book, you share 14 well, here's one statement. I guess I'm going to jump down. Truth rarely hits people over the head. And you write that. How is truth then revealed to people? Because, in ministry, sometimes we Bible thump, right?
Yeah.
So how truth rarely hits people over the head? Talk to me about that.
Emily Dickinson's a very famous poet, and she said, "Tell the truth, but tell it aslant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind." And what does she mean? That there's truth is so big and so difficult to communicate, so difficult to swallow. You introduce it to people a little bit at a time. When there's a lightning strike and children are afraid, you can explain lightning to them, and it begins to take away their fear a little bit. The same thing is the case with truth. The truth from God's perspective isn't just something that falls on you all at once. Because I had a professor who said, well, you only know truth when it hits you in the head. That's actually not, I didn't agree with him on that. I think you can know truth when you walk alongside someone who is seeking truth. The picture a lot of people get is two people butting heads. What if we instead imagine two people side by side walking toward the truth? Then you're getting a little bit more of a biblical picture. That's how Jesus communicated truth. He walked with them, literally, and communicated with them and asked questions of them and honored the fact that they had thought through, we respected the fact that they had thought through things. He didn't ignore the thoughts that they had. He actually asked them about their thoughts. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it does seem to me that we have an opportunity, and especially in pastoral ministry, to sort of reveal a little of the mystery. Think of the pastors you enjoy listening to the most. Isn't there kind of an element of mystery in the way they bring up the mystery first? They talk about the complexity first. And then when they start to help you find biblical answers, you find yourself thinking, aha, I get it. And it's a whole lot more fun because it's like discovering a treasure. That's what I'm thinking of when I'm doing my best to communicate truth in an ideal way.
So right now we've got pastors and ministry leaders thinking, how should we communicate based upon capital T truth? Because we're all about communication. We're about the truth. Please instruct our listeners. How should they communicate that now?
Let me share with you, Trent, some of the things that I've tried to do at Summit Ministries. We're trying to help young adults develop a biblical worldview. And I thought, I need to go deep before I go broad. I need to ask, what are the questions that I personally struggle with? And I've listed them all out. Why would we say the Bible has authority? What is the Bible actually? How did we get the Bible that we have? Why would we say that the Bible is true? What does the Bible say about God? Is there any external evidence aside from Scripture that what the Bible says about God could be true? Are there ways to understand the overall flow of Scripture, or are we just supposed to take it verse by verse and nothing else? And then, what about pain? Why would God allow pain? Why would God allow suffering? Isn't it intolerant to say that we know the truth? And I had dozens of those questions that I listed out. It was quite surprising because I thought that I had dealt with a lot of those, and I had. But I hadn't really just written down those kinds of questions. I think a pastor is in a place of exploring alongside the congregation the foundations. Why do we believe what we believe? Okay, so I'm going to be quoting from the Bible. By the way, anybody know why I'm quoting from the Bible and not from, say, Confucius? It's because I hold that the Bible has authority. Well, what does it mean to say that the Bible has authority? And why would I say the Bible has authority? So people in the pew, I found, really enjoy that. Earlier today, I was speaking at a Christian school, freshman through senior, for 2 hours. 2 hours. And I gave them essentially a college-level presentation on biblical worldview. And they listened because they were being respected. They knew that I honored them and that I believed that they could understand. And so they grasped harder to try to understand it. So I think that's a big part of it. I think being able to talk about today's tough issues. 95% of pastors, according to George Barna, say they believe the Bible speaks to today's issues. When he asked them, which of these have you ever addressed? Only 9% had ever said anything. And virtually all of that was just on the pro-life issue. 2/3 of the people in your congregation are looking for guidance about how their faith applies to the stuff they're going through in their everyday lives. Now, some people say, well, you're just being too political. Well, you got to talk about the talk. Say, listen, I understand when I talk about this issue and I try to find a biblical view, there are people who only think I'm doing it because the end result is I want you to vote Republican or whatever. Say, no, we need to understand what God says about this, how Scripture gives us an understanding. See, that way of approaching it then allows people to relax and say, okay, I'm not being asked to sign a voter registration card here. My pastor's really trying to make a good effort. I might not agree, but I can understand what's going on here, and I don't have to be offended by it.
We're coming to the end of our podcast, and we've had such rich conversation, and you've just dropped pearls of wisdom along the way. I hope our listeners have gleaned that. And if not, they can always go grab your book.
I would encourage people, we've had a lot of churches say, we're picking up copies of that book and doing it as a small group study or a book study. At the end of every chapter, there are 4 points on what do we do now? How should we now live? And those can be discussion questions. So we've had a lot of people do that because you recognize, people are in all different areas of life. They're in their work. 80% of people are not engaged in their work, which means they spent the vast majority of their waking hours doing something they think is meaningless. Yeah. That's an area of ministry for us, bringing that up and then helping people find and discover the meaning that they can have based on truth in the things they do every day. People are going to be with you on that.
Pastors, I encourage you to pick up this book, Truth, by Dr. Jeffrey Myers, and use it for your small groups. Have a small group study on it. There's some incredible tools here, pastors, that I think you could use to encourage yourself and your congregations. One last thing here. One last shot, Dr. Myers, to encourage, to help pastors. If you would give them one last piece of instruction to help them in this context of worldview and truth, what's one really vital thing that you would tell them they need to do today?
I have no idea what the future holds, but I believe that as we carry out the ministry that God has given to us, every day is a gift, and we are doing what God calls us to do. We're just our real prayer is, God, would you help me see what you see and hear what you hear, and draw my attention to the things to which your attention is drawn. This is what world changers in history did. They didn't go to their graves thinking, you know what, I achieved all of my objectives and the world changed as a result. They had no idea. In fact, some of them, things got worse for decades afterward. But they were faithful. And faithfulness is what God called us to.
Amen. Where can viewers go to connect with you or purchase a copy of Truth Changes Everything?
Probably the easiest thing to do is go to summit.org. You can find out about the summer programs that I mentioned for young adults 16 to 22 years of age. I'm very passionate. It's the most important thing that I do is interact with those students every year. And then you can also go to the bookstore there and you'll see Truth Changes Everything. Or if you're driving along right now, not writing any of this down, just Google Truth Changes Everything when you get home, and the book will pop up.
Listeners, you can also contact the Center for Thriving Leaders. We'd be glad to help you connect with that book as well. Dr. Myers, it's been a pleasure today. Enjoyed having you in the Grace College and Seminary podcast room and having you on campus here. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely, Trent.
This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders and Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining us. God bless. This is Dr. Trent Lambert with the Center for Thriving Leaders and Grace Theological Seminary, challenging you to keep thriving in ministry. Thanks for joining us today.